Have you ever imagined entering a place where even the guards were afraid to be alone? In Canada, there's an abandoned prison where the screams of the prisoners echoed for so long that the authorities decided to seal the doors and pretend it never existed. And the most disturbing part? Everything you're about to hear really happened. Imagine dark corridors that seem to stretch endlessly, where the only light comes from broken windows covered in years of dust and neglect. The rusty cells still bear the marks of time, with corroded bars that creak at the slightest touch of wind. Most disturbing, personal belongings have been left behind, scattered across the floor as if everyone had fled in haste, without even time to take their most basic things. Uniforms hang on rusty hooks, yellowed documents lie forgotten on dusty tables, and in some cells, messages scratched into the walls are enough to send chills down your spine. But what really happened in this place? Why does this abandoned prison hold such dark secrets that no one wants to reveal? Have you ever been in a situation where you felt something was wrong, but couldn't quite put your finger on what? That's exactly the feeling that overwhelms anyone who dares to set foot in this forgotten territory. The few retired guards who agreed to talk about their experiences mention inexplicable sounds during the early morning hours, shadows moving through the corridors when no one else was around, and an atmosphere so oppressive that it was impossible to work night shifts without feeling a visceral fear. Stay with me until the end, because what you're about to discover might truly surprise you. This isn't just another story about abandoned places in Canada. It's about a dark chapter that was purposefully erased from official records, about lives that were destroyed within those cold walls, and about why so many people prefer to pretend this place never existed. While Canada is known worldwide for its natural beauty and welcoming cities, few know that hidden in some remote corner lies this monument to human suffering, this scar on history that no one wants to touch. Urban explorers who gained illegal access to the site report an indescribable feeling of being constantly watched. Some vowed never to return after just one visit. Photographs taken inside the prison showed chilling details that defy any logical explanation. And the more you investigate this place, the more you realize there's a systematic pattern of silence, as if there were a tacit agreement to keep everything secret. The truth is, this abandoned prison carries layers upon layers of mystery, each more disturbing than the last. From its construction to the day its doors were last closed, something profoundly wrong was happening inside. And now, after years of silence, it's time to finally bring these buried secrets to light. Prepare yourself, because the story you are about to hear will completely change the way you see abandoned places and the dark secrets they may hold. And if you're not yet subscribed to the channel, now is the perfect time. Click that subscribe button and activate the bell, because every week I bring you a new mystery, a new abandoned place, a new dark story from Canada that will make you question everything you thought you knew about this country. Now let's go back inside this prison and uncover the secrets that have been hidden for so long. Because what happened within the walls of this place goes far beyond what anyone can imagine. The prison we're talking about is Kingston Penitentiary, located in Ontario, Canada. It opened in June 1835 and operated for an impressive 178 years before finally closing its doors in 2013. When it was built, Kingston was considered a revolutionary facility for its time, designed to reform criminals through hard labor and isolation. The official purpose was clear: to transform violent men into productive citizens through rigorous discipline and structured routine. But the truth hidden behind those massive limestone walls tells a completely different story, a dark narrative that the authorities never wanted to come to light. From the earliest years of operation, guards began reporting experiences that defied any logical explanation. Documents archived at the National Library of Canada reveal detailed accounts of inexplicable sounds echoing through the corridors during the early hours of the morning. We're not just talking about the common noises of an old building. Guards described agonizing screams coming from empty cells, heavy footsteps echoing through the blocks when all the prisoners were locked up, and a specific sound that appeared repeatedly in the records, the the dragging of chains in areas where there hadn't been any kind of restraint equipment for decades. But the most disturbing aspect wasn't the sounds. It was what was happening to the prisoners themselves. Men who entered Kingston with full mental capacity began to show signs of complete madness for no apparent reason. Medical records show cases of inmates who developed severe psychotic episodes even without a prior history of mental illness. They spoke of voices, of invisible presences in their cells, of the constant feeling of being watched by something they couldn't identify. Psychiatrists of the time tried to explain it as the effects of prolonged isolation, but there was something deeper happening there, something that transcended conventional scientific explanations. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject and tell you about a specific case that forever marked the dark history of Kingston. In 1947, a prisoner named Matthew Lamb was found dead in his cell in the isolation block. The official version declared suicide, but the details never made sense. Matthew was under constant surveillance due to previous suicide attempts, and the guards swore they checked his cell only 15 minutes before the body was discovered. Most disturbingly, Matthew was found hanged with his own bedsheets, but the height of the ceiling and the position of the body made it physically impossible for him to have done it alone. The guard who found him, a man named Robert Chen, gave an exclusive interview to a local newspaper years after retiring. His words were chilling and accurate. He described the scene as something out of a nightmare. Matthew's body swayed slightly, even without a draft, and the frozen expression on his face was not that of someone who had taken his own life, but of absolute terror, as if he had seen something horrifying in his last moments. Robert also mentioned that immediately after finding the body, he felt an oppressive presence in the cell, an energy so dense that he could barely breathe. He requested a transfer the next day and never set foot in that block again. But Matthew Lamb's death was just one of dozens of similar incidents that punctuate the history of Kingston Penitentiary. In 1932, there was the case of Block H, where 5 different prisoners reported seeing the same apparition over a 3-week period. A shadowy figure dressed in an old guard's uniform who simply watched through the bars and disappeared when looked directly at. The psychological impact was so severe that 2 of these men were transferred to psychiatric institutions and never fully recovered their sanity. Internal documents obtained through Freedom of Information requests reveal that the Kingston administration kept detailed records of these events, but always classified them as unconventional incidents. There was even a specific protocol for when guards reported paranormal experiences. They were immediately removed from their shift, subjected to psychological evaluation, and instructed not to discuss the incident with anyone. This policy of systematic silence created a culture of fear and denial that persisted for generations. One of the most shocking testimonies comes from a nurse who worked in the Kingston Infirmary between 1965 and 1973. In a recorded statement for an independent documentary that was never released, she describes how prisoners arrived at the infirmary with injuries they couldn't explain. Deep scratches on their backs forming specific patterns, burns with no apparent heat source, and in extreme cases, marks that looked like human bites in places on the body that would be impossible to reach alone. The woman's journey from initial skepticism to accepting that something inexplicable was happening in that place is documented and chillingly compelling. The revelations don't stop there. There's also the traumatic event of 1954, when a violent rebellion resulted in the deaths of 2 guards and 6 prisoners. What made this event particularly disturbing was the behavior of the inmates involved. According to official reports, they seemed to be in a trance, acting in a coordinated manner but without apparent verbal communication, as if guided by an invisible collective mentality. After the rebellion was brought under control, none of the survivors could explain why they had participated or what really happened during those chaotic hours. The truth is that Kingston Penitentiary accumulated layer upon layer of tragedy, suffering, and mystery over nearly 2 centuries of operation. Every decision made within those walls, every life lost, every moment of utter despair left an indelible mark that continues to throb even after its official closure. And when you start connecting all these dots, you realize we're not just talking about a prison with a violent past. We're talking about a place where the line between the explainable and the inexplicable has been completely erased. If this story left you speechless, just like it left me, Write it in the comments. Kingston left me speechless. Places like this remind us that some truth should perhaps never be discovered. Now, I want to delve even deeper into this subject and reveal what was actually found when explorers, historians, and even demolition crews entered the oldest areas of Kingston Penitentiary. What these people discovered goes far beyond simple vestiges of an abandoned prison. We are talking about physical evidence that tells stories that no one dared to officially document during all those years of operation. The walls of Kingston bear messages that were literally scratched into the stone by desperate fingers. These aren't simple graffiti or scribbles. They are words etched with such force that you can feel the desperation in every jagged line. One of the most disturbing messages was found in the North Isolation Wing and read, "They come when the lights go out. I'm not crazy, they are real." Just below, another different hand had written, "I see them too. God forbid we leave here." The transformation of skepticism into palpable terror in these words reveals a devastating psychological journey these men faced alone, with no one to believe them. But the messages are only the surface. When maintenance crews removed old wooden panels in 2012, shortly before the official closure, they found objects hidden in wall cavities that simply shouldn't have been there. Small makeshift crucifixes made of nails and wire, hand-sewn rag dolls with grotesque expressions, and most disturbing of all, human teeth arranged in specific circular patterns. No one could explain how these objects got into those sealed cavities or what their real purpose was. Some speculate they were desperate attempts at spiritual protection against something haunting those corridors. The basement of Kingston Prison is a chapter apart in this dark story. For decades, only a handful of people had authorized access to that area. The underground space extends far beyond what the visible structure of the prison suggests, with narrow tunnels connecting different blocks and areas that never appear on official architectural plans. A former maintenance worker revealed in an anonymous interview that certain sectors of the basement were informally called dead zones because electronic equipment simply stopped working there. Flashlights failed for no reason, radios emitted only static, and the feeling of oppression was so intense that many refused to work alone in those areas. Behind the scenes of Kingston's daily operations, rumors circulated that were never officially confirmed, but consistently appear in dozens of independent testimonies. There are allegations that during the 1940s and 1950s, psychological experiments were conducted on specific prisoners without their consent or knowledge. These practices allegedly included extreme sensory deprivation, exposure to mind-altering substances, and interrogation techniques bordering on psychological torture. Partially destroyed documents found during the evacuation process suggest the existence of a classified program that used inmates as test subjects for behavioral control methods. Inhumane punishments are another aspect of this hidden truth that has only recently begun to emerge. The Isolation Wing, officially called the Segregation Unit, was where prisoners considered problematic were sent. Imagine being locked in a cell measuring 2 by 3 meters, where sunlight never reaches, where the only sound is the echo of your own thoughts and the distant groans of other men slowly losing their sanity. Some inmates spent months in these conditions without meaningful human contact, fed through an opening in the door, living in near-complete darkness, 23 hours a day. The psychological impact was devastating and permanent. There are also unconfirmed reports of deaths that were never recorded in official documents. Retired guards speak in whispers about prisoners who simply disappeared from the records, as if they had never existed. Family members who went to visit were informed that the inmate had been transferred to another facility, but when they investigated, they discovered that there was no record of this transfer anywhere. These cases raise disturbing questions about decisions that were made at the highest levels of prison administration and that may have resulted in systematic cover-ups. The most haunted cell in all of Kingston Penitentiary is located in Block D, cell number 13. This particular cell has such a sinister reputation that even veteran guards avoided passing by it during night shifts. Multiple prisoners who were placed there reported the same experiences: the sensation of invisible hands touching their shoulders, unintelligible whispers during the early morning hours, and the recurring sight of a male figure standing in the corner of the cell that disappeared when they looked directly at it. One inmate in particular categorically refused to return to that cell after a single night, preferring to face severe disciplinary punishment rather than spend another minute in that space. During the last decade of Kingston's operation, as authorities began planning its closure, teams were sent to catalog and remove all belongings and equipment. It was during this process that they discovered a basement room that was not on any official architectural plans. The door was sealed with bricks and mortar, as if someone had tried to erase its existence completely. When they finally opened it, they found a small room with walls covered in deep scratches, as if something or someone had desperately tried to escape. In the center of the room was a rusty metal chair with wear marks on the arms and legs, suggesting it had been used for restraint for extended periods. Revelations continue to emerge as more people who worked at Kingston find the courage to share their experiences. The mentality of silence that dominated the institution for so many decades is finally being broken, and each new testimony adds another layer to this dark narrative. What is becoming clear is that Kingston Penitentiary was not just a prison where people served sentences. It was a place where humanity was systematically destroyed, where unimaginable suffering took place far from the public eye, and where forces we cannot fully explain seem to have found a permanent home. If just imagining it gave you goosebumps, write it in the comments. I would never sleep in cell 13. But what I discovered later makes it all the more disturbing. I'm going to answer the question that's probably been echoing in your head since the beginning of this video. Why on earth does nobody talk openly about Kingston Penitentiary? Why does an institution that operated for almost 2 centuries, that housed some of Canada's most notorious criminals, and that clearly has such a disturbing history, remain virtually absent from public conversations about haunted places or dark stories in the country? The answer lies buried beneath layers of political decisions, deep institutional shame, and a genuine fear of the legal consequences that could arise if the whole truth came to light. When Kingston finally closed its doors in 2013, there were no grand public ceremonies, no official government documentaries, no real acknowledgement of what that place represented in Canadian history. It was a quiet, almost furtive closure, as if the authorities simply wanted to turn the page and pretend those 178 years never happened. The behind-the-scenes story of this conspiracy of silence is both fascinating and terrifying. Numerous lawsuits have been filed by former inmates and family members of prisoners who died under questionable circumstances inside Kingston. Most of these lawsuits were settled through confidential agreements, with specific clauses prohibiting the parties from publicly discussing the details. This systematic legal strategy created a nearly impenetrable barrier around the truth. Human rights lawyers estimate that the Canadian government has paid millions of dollars in secret settlements over the past 3 decades, all to keep certain aspects of the Kingston operation out of the public eye. There is also the issue of the political scandals that would certainly emerge if there were a full and transparent investigation into everything that happened in those facilities. Prominent political figures, including former justice ministers and directors of the Canadian prison system, made decisions over the years that directly resulted in extreme human suffering. Approving budgets that left critical areas without adequate maintenance, ignoring reports of systemic abuse, implementing isolation policies that experts warned were psychologically destructive. Making these facts public knowledge could destroy reputations and political legacies that have been carefully built over decades. What makes this situation even more disturbing are the documented attempts to literally erase Kingston's past. In 2014, just a year after its closure, there was a serious proposal for the complete demolition of the structure. The official argument was that maintaining the building would be economically unviable and that the area could be repurposed for commercial purposes. But when you analyze the internal documents that were subsequently leaked, it becomes clear that there was a specific mindset behind this decision: to physically eliminate the evidence, to destroy the very place where so many atrocities occurred, to remove from the Canadian landscape this constant reminder of systemic failures and institutionalized suffering. Demolition never happened, but not for lack of trying. Historic preservation groups and human rights activists fought fiercely to keep Kingston standing, arguing that destroying the site would be an attempt to erase the memory of all who suffered there. The impact of that battle still resonates today. The building remains, but in a bizarre state of limbo, neither fully preserved as a historical landmark, nor completely abandoned to oblivion. And then, there are the documents that simply disappeared. Researchers who attempted to access complete Kingston records through the National Archives of Canada discovered inexplicable gaps. Entire periods, especially from the 1940s to the 1960s, have extremely limited documentation or documentation classified under security levels normally reserved for national security matters. When questioned, authorities offer vague explanations about inadequate filing processes or damage caused by water and mold. But the consistency of these losses across specific periods raises obvious questions about whether there was a deliberate purge of incriminating evidence. Urban explorers and independent investigators who attempted to expose the truth about Kingston faced significant obstacles. Several individuals who gained illegal access to the site and published photos or videos online received legal notices demanding the immediate removal of the content. Some were heavily fined. Others faced threats of criminal prosecution for trespassing. There is one particular case of a documentary filmmaker who spent 2 years researching Kingston, interviewing former guards and former inmates, collecting photographic evidence, and constructing a comprehensive narrative about the systemic abuses. His project was abruptly cancelled when his funders withdrew under unspecified pressure, and all the material he had collected mysteriously disappeared from his studio during an alleged break-in, where nothing else was taken. Today, access to Kingston Penitentiary is strictly controlled. The property has undergone several management changes since its closure and currently offers limited sightseeing tours at specific times. But these tours are carefully orchestrated, showing only select areas, telling only sanitized versions of the story, completely avoiding the most problematic locations and disturbing narratives. The basement remains completely off-limits. The isolation wing is not included in the standard tour. Cell 13 in Block D? Officially, it has been under restoration for years, although no one seems to be actually working there. The risks of attempting to access Kingston outside of official tours are real and substantial. The property is monitored by extensive security cameras, and there are private guards making regular rounds. People who have been caught trying to enter illegally report not only legal consequences, but also extremely disturbing experiences that made them question their decisions. One group of 5 urban explorers who managed to spend several hours inside Kingston overnight came away completely traumatized. They described an oppressive presence that intensified as they went deeper into the building, equipment that malfunctioned without explanation, and a growing sense of terror that eventually forced them to flee before completing their exploration. The hidden truth here is that Kingston Penitentiary represents something Canadian institutions don't want to confront: the physical and historical evidence that the country's prison system inflicted systematic suffering and possibly conducted practices that violated fundamental human rights for decades. Openly acknowledging this would demand accountability, substantial reparations, and a complete reassessment of how Canada treats incarcerated people to this day. It's easier, from a political and institutional standpoint, to remain silent, control the narrative, and let Kingston slowly rot on the margins of collective memory. Leave a comment below. The truth always comes out. If you believe that no secret from the past remains hidden forever. Now, I want to delve even deeper into this subject and reflect on what Kingston Penitentiary truly represents when we look beyond the haunted stories and unexplained events. Because ultimately, this place is a dark mirror, reflecting how our society treated human beings who made mistakes, how our institutions systematically and repeatedly failed, and how our collective decisions shaped the fate of thousands of lives forgotten within those limestone walls. Kingston's legacy forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about the mentality that permeated the prison system not only in Canada, but in much of the Western world during the 19th and 20th centuries. The idea that extreme isolation and harsh punishment could reform criminals was fundamentally flawed from the start. Psychology experts today acknowledge that the type of solitary confinement practiced in Kingston causes permanent psychological damage, equivalent to torture in many respects. But for decades, this was considered not only acceptable, but desirable. The transformation these institutions promised never happened because the method itself was inherently destructive to the human psyche. When you stop to think about the generational impact that places like Kingston have had, the magnitude becomes overwhelming. We're not just talking about the prisoners who spent years or decades in those cells. We're talking about their families that were destroyed, children who grew up without parents, entire communities affected by the prolonged absence of their members. We're talking about the guards who developed psychological disorders from witnessing and participating in a brutal system, who carried these traumas into their own homes, who never fully processed what they experienced during their shifts. The circle of suffering extends far beyond the physical walls of the prison. Kingston is not alone on this dark journey through Canadian history. The country is dotted with abandoned places that carry equally disturbing stories, each revealing different aspects of institutional failures and human suffering. The provincial lunatic asylum in Toronto, closed in 1979, was known for barbarously inhumane psychiatric practices, including forced lobotomies and shock therapy without proper consent. Tranquil Hospital in British Columbia, which operated from 1907 to 1983, began as a sanatorium for tuberculosis, but eventually became a psychiatric institution where patients were subjected to questionable medical experiments and chronic neglect. There is also the network of Indigenous residential schools scattered throughout Canada, many now abandoned, which represent one of the darkest chapters in Canadian history. These places were the scene of systematic abuse, enforced cultural erasure, and intergenerational trauma that continues to impact Indigenous communities to this day. Recent revelations of unmarked graves containing the remains of hundreds of Indigenous children have brought to light how much we still don't know about what really happened in these places. The hidden truth in these abandoned sites continues to emerge slowly, painfully, forcing recognition and accountability decades after the events. What all these abandoned institutions have in common is a systemic attempt to control, reform, and often punish people deemed undesirable or problematic by the dominant society. Prisoners, people with mental illnesses, Indigenous peoples, all were subjected to systems that promised help or rehabilitation, but delivered trauma and destruction. And when these systems finally collapsed under the weight of their own failures, the buildings were simply abandoned, left to rot as silent monuments to errors we prefer not to confront directly. This brings me to a question that should haunt us all. How many other places like Kingston exist, not just in Canada, but around the world, hiding stories we will never fully know? How many voices have been permanently silenced? How much suffering has never been documented? How many injustices have been buried along with those who experienced them? The honest answer is that we will probably never know the full extent. Many records were intentionally destroyed. Many witnesses died without sharing their experiences. Many places were demolished before they could be properly investigated. The impact of this deliberate institutional amnesia goes far beyond history. It affects how we deal with our prison system today, how we treat people with mental illness currently, and how we relate to marginalized communities in the present. When we don't honestly confront our past, when we allow places like Kingston to exist in a limbo of half-forgetfulness, we perpetuate the same patterns of denial and neglect that created these problems in the first place. The journey toward more just and humane systems requires us to look directly at our historical failures, however uncomfortable that may be. There is something deeply disturbing about how our society deals with memory and forgetting. We build elaborate monuments to celebrate achievements and victories, but the places that document our worst moments are left to decay in silence. Kingston Penitentiary should be a place of active memory, a space where people could learn about the real consequences of inhumane policies, where students could directly confront the human cost of extreme punitive systems. Instead, we offer sanitized tours that treat the site as a historical curiosity, carefully avoiding the most difficult issues and the most painful truths. The transformation we need is not of physical buildings. but of our collective mindset about how we deal with these dark histories. We need to develop the courage to look directly into the abyss of our own past, to acknowledge that the institutions we created caused immeasurable harm, to accept collective responsibility for allowing these systems to continue operating decades after their fundamental flaws became clear. Only through this honest confrontation can we hope to build something better in the future. And perhaps the most chilling aspect of this whole story is realizing that Kingston Penitentiary is not an isolated case of institutional cruelty in the distant past. It is part of an ongoing pattern of how we treat people whom our society decides are beyond the bounds of normal compassion. The specific methods may have changed. The extreme isolation of Kingston may have been officially abandoned in most places. But the underlying mentality of punishment over rehabilitation, of dehumanization over dignity, still permeates many aspects of our modern prison systems. The revelations that emerge from places like Kingston are invitations to deep reflection on who we are as a society, what values we truly uphold, and what kind of legacy we are creating for future generations to examine and judge. The ghosts that haunt these abandoned corridors are not merely supernatural manifestations, but the unresolved consequences of concrete human decisions that have caused real and measurable suffering. If you've made it this far, it's because this story touched you the same way it touched me. These forgotten places, like Kingston, remind us that history never truly disappears. It just waits for someone willing to listen to it. So, if this journey through the dark side of Canada has left its mark on you, join this community that refuses to let these memories fade. Subscribe to the channel here so you do not miss the next hidden chapter that we'll uncover together. Do you know of any other haunted prisons or abandoned places in Canada? Tell us in the comments. Tell us in the comments. Which place would you like me to investigate in the next video? Leave a like because it helps this story reach more people who, like us, want to keep the memory alive. There's another video right here that connects perfectly with this one. Click on it and continue with me on this journey through the forgotten side of Canada. See you then.